he concludes that God exists, so God, representative God, objective God exists and has all perfections, and therefore he concludes that because God exists and God has all perfections, then he is not a deceiver, and my clear and distinct perceptions are justified. Now this leads us to the problem of what we called the Cartesian circle. So the Cartesian circle goes like this. My clear and distinct perceptions are justified as long as God is no deceiver. I know God is no deceiver because I have a clear and distinct perception of God as the being possessing all perfections. So as you can see, that's a bit circular. So that's the argument that he makes in Meditation 3. Another type of argument that he makes in the third meditation is just this idea, look, that something has to possess at least as much representative reality as it does formal reality. The formal reality of God is infinite. Therefore, the representative reality must be infinite as well. So God exists infinitely that way. Okay, so in the fifth Meditations, Descartes starts off talking about objects, and more appropriately talks about his ideas of objects. And then he goes back into this whole idea of he's trying to get back into the clear and distinct perception things. And the things that he thinks are clear and distinct about objects are they have to have dimensions, or quantities as he calls them, which are essentially dimensions, extension, size, shape, location. It has to be somewhere within time and space, and motion itself. Both the potential to have motion and the motion that goes on within the object. And he essentially, what he's saying is, this is my definition of an object. So if an object exists, it necessarily has these characteristics. Descartes' a Platonist, right? At least when it comes to the existence of abstract objects. This is a direct quote from the fifth meditation. I find in myself countless ideas of things that can't be called nothing, even if they don't exist anywhere outside of me. So he's saying that abstract objects can exist. And then he gets into this concept of essences, which essentially, again, goes back to his idea of clear and distinct perceptions. He says that an essence is something's true and immutable nature. I don't know if I mentioned, I had intended to mention what immutable means in class on Thursday, but I think I got caught up doing something else. Anyway, immutable means it can't be changed. It doesn't change. He says, when I consider a triangle, I am constrained in thought because there is a determinate essence to a triangle. So the determinate essence of a triangle is that it's a three-sided figure, three-sided polygon. Its interior angles sum up to 180 degrees, etc., etc. He goes on to define an essence as a property or set of properties a thing cannot do without, so it can't exist without. A triangle can't be a triangle without three sides. There's a slightly different epistemological way that both Aristotle got to essences one way, Plato got to them another way, and Descartes gets to them in a similar way to Plato. Aristotle thought that we learned the essence of the thing. We learned the essence of a triangle by observing triangles in nature. So, that's the chief distinction, I mean, broadly speaking, between Aristotle and Plato, is that Aristotle started with a particular object and worked out to a universal concept, whereas Plato believed that you start with the and Descartes start with the universal concept and you work your way down to particulars that way. And Descartes has a good objection to Aristotle's particular view. He says, if we start with the particular, how can we have any concept of what a perfect triangle or a perfect circle or whatever is? Because, there are no such things in reality. They just don't exist. So it seems kind of crazy to say that you start with this imperfect thing and you can go to a perfect thing. Okay, so Descartes gives, one of his more controversial arguments, and this is called the ontological argument. So here's the sort of the generic setup of the argument. This is an ontological argument. Could be for anything. I have in my thoughts an idea of something X. I clearly and distinctly perceive X to have a certain property. Therefore, X has that property. So when you apply this argument to the existence of God, it looks like this. I have in my thoughts an idea of God. I clearly and distinctly perceive God to possess all perfections. existence is a perfection, therefore God exists. Descartes, he realizes that this seems a little bit slippery. So, he says a lot of people are going to say this looks like a trick. So here are some objections that Descartes considers to the ontological argument. He says there's a distinction between an essence and necessarily meaning that that thing exists, even if existence is part of the essence. For example, I know the essential qualities of a triangle are that it has three sides, that its interior angles are 180 degrees, etc., but that does not imply that that triangle exists in nature. And we said, as a matter of fact, it probably doesn't exist in nature. But Descartes replies, look, God is different than triangle, because God, one of his necessary properties, just like a triangle having three sides, is that God necessarily exists. So God is the only being that has existence as one of its defining characteristics. The other objection is I can attach existence to God in my thoughts without God actually existing. He says this is just false reasoning. He says my thoughts do not make necessities, rather my thinking is constrained by necessity and possibility. So you don't. He says you don't have to think about God, or you don't have to think about triangles. But if you do think about triangles, you have to think about triangles having three sides and having 180 degrees. Just similarly, if you do think about God, you have to think about God existing, according to Descartes. The final thing is, what entitles me to think that God has all perfections? Why can't God be something different? Once again, he goes back to his same reply. Look, if you sit down and think clearly about God, you're going to come to this conclusion that God necessarily. It's clear and distinct that if you're thinking about God, then God has to be a being that possesses all perfections, and being a being that possesses all perfections means that existence is perfection, because it's what's better. Is it better for there to be an all perfect being that exists, or an all perfect being that does not exist? And Descartes thinks it's obvious that it needs to exist. And this leads to a common objection that Kant and several other philosophers throughout the years have thrown against Descartes. And one of the main objections to the ontological argument is, existence is not a property just like redness, for example. So, it's, as I said in class, it's much different to say the marker is blue and to say that the marker exists. It seems like the is blue part denotes something completely different than the thing of saying the marker exists. It's almost like, in some ways, when you say the marker and you're trying to make a reference to that, you're almost implying that it exists. Otherwise, your statement is nonsensical. So, Kant makes the argument, look, it's just existence is not a property that can be attributed to something like, say, being all-powerful or all-knowing, things like that. It's a little bit of a confused idea to try to attribute existence to God. And then, Descartes uses this essentially once again to justify his position. He says, I have this problem as an imperfect being. I do have these clear and distinct perceptions, but sometimes, I just can't think about them all the time. Sure, it's easy to think about 2 + 2 = 4, but he says once you get into more complicated things, you just can't focus on those things at all time. So that's when you're led to doubt and you think, well, maybe that wasn't a clear and distinct perception. But he says, if you have this idea of God as being all perfect, then you can trust your clear and distinct perceptions, which of course leads us right back into the Cartesian circle. And that's where we stopped. So that was essentially week 4. Basically, the important thing to remember is that, according to Descartes, these ideas of clear and distinct perceptions create sort of, some people have said that Descartes was looking for a new way to justify truth. And according to him, his truth are these clear and distinct perceptions. And he has a clear and distinct perception of God existing. And because he has this clear and distinct perception of God existing as being all perfect, then he can trust these clear and distinct perceptions. It's a little bit circular, but there you have it. So we'll be looking at Pascal and Hume this week. See you tomorrow.